The way I think about it, when I started as a medical student in 1974 and then as a CCU director in 1980, it was all about whoever showed up at your door as a doctor, you did the best you could with that person in the circumstances they were in. There was no way to know about all the people who weren't showing up at your door. Now, I can assure you, having worked at Alphabet, we know about all 8 billion people on the face of the earth. And I think the worst, it's no longer suitable to say we're just going to do a good job with the people that we see. Somewhere in the system, there has to be accountability for all the people that are outside the system.
Welcome to The Digital Pulse, a podcast from MPJ Digital Medicine, where we explore the ideas, innovations, and people shaping the future of healthcare. I'm Dr. Benjamin Mazer, a medical journalist and practicing pathologist at Johns Hopkins University. In this episode, I'm joined by Journal Editor-in-Chief Dr. Joseph Kvedar, a Harvard dermatologist. Together, we talked to former FDA Commissioner Robert Califf. Dr. Califf is an academic cardiologist whose experience in government and industry gives him unique insights into the medical AI revolution. We hope you'll enjoy our conversation with this preeminent thought leader. All right, welcome everyone to the second episode of the NPJ Digital Medicine podcast, The Digital Pulse. We're really excited to have Dr. Robert Califf here today, who really has quite a storied history in academia, in industry, and regulation. He is a cardiologist and was at Duke for most of his career and involved in many pivotal clinical trials. He then went to FDA as a deputy commissioner and then commissioner under the end of the Obama administration first, and then came back during the Biden administration and had a long tenure as FDA commissioner there, where he was big on AI, medical misinformation, obviously had to deal with the pandemic. Love to hear about that. And, so we're here obviously to talk about digital medicine generally, but in between, I should say, he also had a stint at Google doing as sort of a medical advisor at Google and their parent companies and many subsidiaries. And so obviously has a lot of industry experience there. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
Yeah, I'd love, to me, the thing that is kind of an inflection point in AI and digital medicine is generative AI and sort of the widespread adoption by consumers. These were things that no one was really thinking much about until a few years ago, and all of a sudden now companies like ChatGPT, Anthropic, Google, Microsoft has this. Everyone does. They have hundreds of millions of users of these kind of chat programs. They have billions of dollars in revenue. I mean, this is from zero, just a couple of years ago. So to me, that's the story. And I'd love to hear if you think doctors and regulators are kind of keeping up with generative AI and the developments in industry.
Well, if we start from that point, I guess I'd have to say none of us are. It's kind of interesting for me because during my time at Alphabet, I'm not a computer scientist. I'm really a translator mostly between quantitative people and clinical practice. That's been most of my career. So I don't pretend to be a leader in any of this, but during my time at Alphabet, I was hanging out with a lot of people who were having these discussions about where this was going to go. And of course, 3 of those people won Nobel Prizes. And there's a lot written and talked about now about how different basically computing as it relates to AI is now compared to even 2017 to 2022, which is when I was there. But it wasn't as if they didn't see it coming, and there's several recent books that go through this. But I think, the place I would start is to say the people that created generative AI don't know how it works. I mean, they know a lot about it, and they sort of started a fire, but the fire is running quickly. So none of us, I think, are completely able to keep up with it. And there are many things about it that are already useful and beneficial. And there's some very significant risks at the same time.
Yeah. What do you think is like the most useful application right now? Is it on the consumer side, on the physician side, research side,
I,
something else?
I mean, from what I can see, if you said what's one thing that has really become useful very quickly, it's open evidence.
Hmm.
Here you have a product that does something that a group of us tried to get Google to do 15 years ago, and they correctly told us that as good as Google technology was, it wasn't good enough.
Hmm.
But the idea that you can take curated clinical practice guidelines and evidence generated by professional societies and other reputable groups, put it in a rag, and have instantaneous, up-to-date, generative question answering on the internet is exactly what we were hoping for 15 years ago. And they've done it. And to have 70% of clinicians using it already in 18 months with no sales force, that's telling you how useful it is. And I use it every day, and I'm not even practicing anymore. Every day I get at least one call or email from somebody who needs help trying to navigate our ridiculously inept healthcare system. And so I'm sort of a proxy doctor, and it's amazing to me how useful it is every day. And there are obviously millions of people getting their routine questions
Hmm.
answered. But then we have the risk on the other side. There's growing evidence, some of it, I think, in your journal, that if you prompt generative AI with the wrong questions or you don't know how to interpret the output, you can make serious mistakes that affect individuals. But I look at that part of it very much like driving when we first started using the clunky Siri app on Apple. It was not all that great, but once it caught on, it just gets better by the minute.
Yeah.
Which one? Fred Apple or
What?
Jerry?
Oh, you
Apple's
got
talking to me right now. Let me turn off. Let me turn
That's
this off.
great.
Yeah, I maybe I shouldn't admit it, but yeah, open evidence is great as a pathologist, which is what I am, because it's sort of like a little clinical consult. I don't have to ask my clinical colleagues if I have some question about some disease, or actually, you get relatives and friends and stuff who ask you medical things, and as an internist, you're probably a lot better able to answer them than I am as a pathologist if it's a non-pathology question. So I can just ask open evidence and, give them some
Well,
kind of guidance.
over the weekend, I found myself on a panel with Scott Gottlieb right before me and Bob Wachter right after. And a
Hmm.
lot of the discussion was about AI. And I thought Bob made a really important point. He said, basically, as for those who don't know, Bob Wachter is the chair of medicine at UCSF, and it's just written a book about AI and previous other important books about electronic health records and such. And he said the main use of open evidence now is he used to have to curbside a nephrologist or a cardiologist to just ask a question. Now it's basically, as you put it, his companion curbside doctor.
Yeah.
And you still have to have a brain to use it. But
You know,
I think it's going to get better and better.
Yeah.
we're on the ground floor for sure. There's one. I'm a dermatologist. In my field, there's one that's just trained on the dermatology literature that, as I see patients, I have in the background all the time. You know,
Well, you mentioned dermatology. I got to get this off my chest since we were talking about
uh-oh.
alphabet. If there's one use of AI that just is crying out, it's skin lesions. And when I was at Alphabet, it was driving us crazy when we talked to the folks at Search or YouTube. There are literally millions of people asking questions about their skin lesions on the internet.
Hmm.
And it's just crying out for digital methods with combining with clinical outcomes because people are waiting 6 months with melanomas to see a dermatologist. It's insane.
Yeah.
Um, but there's something about the interface of the technology, the clinical specialty, and the regulation, which has not enabled it to go the way it should at this point.
Well, we could digress on that. I'll just say a couple things because we're interviewing you, and but anyway, one is that the best use cases for AI from a technical perspective are pigmented lesions. That's the worst from a what if the computer gets it wrong perspective. So everyone's kind of tiptoeing around. Well, do you really want to delegate your melanoma diagnosis to a computer? And I certainly, as a dermatologist, it would not make me any more effective or better because I've got 40 years of looking at skin lesions under my belt. But as a primary care doctor, it might. So how do we migrate that? With rashes and so forth, much less consistency in what actually comes up. So we have a ways to go. I think there's more and more interest. There's a robust program at the American Academy of Dermatology. So they're not burying their heads in the sand, but there's some things to be worked out. I was going to ask just back to regulation and your expertise. The current commissioner has made the statement that we are essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but moving too slow, that certain things should be able to come on the market without intensive regulatory scrutiny, particularly in the wearable space, I think. The term was used as where we should be working at Silicon Valley speed. So is that true? Are regulators too ponderous and market conditions are moving fast? How do we connect those two?
Well, I think your discussion about dermatology is a good entree into that discussion. And there's a phrase that came up over the weekend several times was Joe Biden's thing about don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And
Sure,
so,
sure.
whereas a patient seeing you in clinic has the benefit of your 40 years experience, the one who's just trying to get an appointment and can't do it has a
Sure.
pretty bad alternative compared to
Right.
a not completely correct digital AI-driven system. So there's the way I look at this, there's some parts, I'll just start from the top. There's some parts of AI that are part of a traditional device, like a defibrillator. That
Hmm.
part needs to be regulated like traditional devices. And I don't think many people disagree with that. The big place where we could move faster is in the area of decision support. Um, and then we have on the far end administrative support. I want to come back to that in a minute because that's exempt from regulation now. So we can't blame any of that on the regulators. But the decision support and the use in, let's just say, wearables where it begins to get into the decision support part. Because also remember, if it's just saying you're healthy and we're going to help you stay healthy, that's also not regulated. It's
Hmm.
under discretion right now, and the FDA has declared we're not regulating that. That's not new. It's been that way. But it's when you start to get into say, this looks like atrial fib, um, and it begins to sound like a diagnosis and a medical recommendation. The way I look at it, this is going to become like the way we drive cars, where we started out being skeptical. Then now we all depend on it, and none of us have maps in our cars because we don't need them. And as we move along that continuum, the question is, how do you regulate it? And I'll just say a couple things about it. Traditional regulatory schemas are too slow. I agree with that. But there needs to be accountability of some kind. Otherwise, we will have many catastrophes that are actually likely to lead to overregulation because that's sort of the history
Yeah.
of FDA regulation. Things go along, something terrible happens. Everybody says, where were the regulators? Congress passes a law, and then it has to be adjusted. I think the primary responsibility for most decision support in AI now really needs to reside with the health systems that employ the clinicians that are using it. And I want to come back to consumer AI in just a minute, but in that sphere, which is huge, the analogy that I've been using, and it's definitely not policy now, is that AI should be regulated like food safety, not like traditional devices.
Hmm.
In our national food safety system, which according to The Economist is tied for first in the world with Denmark, it's not perfect. We're all aware there are food safety issues that come up. But the way it works is rather than regulating, having an FDA inspector on every farm every day, what we have are a set of 10 principles called the Food Safety Modernization Act principles. Everyone has agreed to them. They're relatively high level. Um, and whether you're a farm, a distributor of food, a grocery store, or a restaurant, you have to abide by those 10 principles and translate those principles into practice locally, and you're accountable for doing that. Then you get checked only every 3 or every 5 years
Hmm.
as to how you're doing. And I think if you look at decision support in the context of healthcare systems, there's no better, just like a grocery store is responsible for the food it sells. I think that health systems need to be the accountable entity. And, to do that would take a law. It would also take
Mhm.
agreeing on principles. And I think one of the biggest problems right now is and I just came from a meeting this morning with some people that are working with vendors trying to sell AI to health systems. They're all saying the health systems don't care at all about clinical outcomes. The only thing they care about is what's the net present value, what's the financial return. So if principle number one was your AI has to produce equitable improvement in health outcomes, I think we'd see an entirely different system of AI being implemented. But our nation's best health systems are not demanding that. So I'm hoping that eventually, and it'll probably take a few bad things happening, I hope Congress will eventually pass a law assigning this responsibility with a set of principles, which can evolve as we learn more about it. Now, the other
You
big
know,
area is consumer AI, which you've referred to, and that is just out there in Nowheresville right now. It's not really regulated. Congress has declared it's not going to regulate it. Um, and, the only place that'll start to fall into regulation is where it begins to bleed over into more traditional healthcare delivery. So we've got a lot to learn about that. I think it should be regulated the same way. If you're going to apply AI to health, whether you're in a health system or you're out there in the wild, um, you ought to be held to a standard of principle-based application of the AI. Now, I could say a lot
Yeah.
more about this, but that's just sort of an opener for a way to think about it.
Yeah.
Because if you try to do it the traditional way, the FDA would need to hire another 50,000 people, and that's not going to happen, nor do I think it would be good for
it
the continuous innovation that's needed.
it seems like an interesting through line between both these things you're saying on the healthcare system side and the consumer side is recognizing that the physician is not the only one providing medical care or sort of a diagnosis or a treatment plan anymore. It used to be that no matter all the technology you used, whatever the sort of end result of the medical diagnosis flowed through a doctor. And it seems like you want us to recognize that actually, the health systems themselves are providing care, which I think doctors have recognized for a while that you work within the limits of the healthcare system that affects patient care as much as what you do individually. The insurance companies affect patient care in a significant way, even though they're not technically treating anyone. And in the same way, now technology is getting closer and closer to providing the work of a doctor, and not in a scary way, sometimes in a very good way, both like to consumers at home or just as part of a kind of clinic workflow. So I'm curious what you think of that. Is that we have to stop thinking of doctors as the ones who provide medical care, or expand our idea of it?
Yes. I mean, I think most of us are well beyond that. I mean, most doctors are employees now, right? So just the very idea that the doctor is an autonomous agent with a fiduciary responsibility to the patient, something that's sort of sacred, I think, to people like us. It's the way we grew up. But
Yeah.
there's a constraint on all doctors now to the extent they're employees. They don't have the freedom to operate outside of whatever the standards or requirements of their healthcare systems. But beyond that, the way I think about it, when I started as a medical student in 1974 and then as a CCU director in 1980, it was all about whoever showed up at your door as a doctor, you did the best you could with that person in the circumstances they were in. There was no way to know about all the people who weren't showing up at your door. Now, I can assure you, having worked at Alphabet, we know about all 8 billion people on the face of the earth.
Mhm.
They can be identified. And I think the worst, it's no longer suitable to say we're just going to do a good job with the people that we see. Somewhere in the system, there has to be accountability for all the people that are outside the system. Over half of Americans can't identify a primary care doctor right now. And I happen to know at both of your home institutions, there are faculty who are very upset that their own families can't get primary care appointments. And
Sure.
so it only makes sense that we would extend digital technology to um, improve the plight of the people who are getting the worst, and then make it better and better so that it provides functions. And I'll mention one other one, which I've worked with several groups now on this, and being a cardiologist here, I can talk trash all I want to. When it comes to the treatment of hyperlipidemia and hypertension, in general, it's fair to say that a good algorithm and a high school student can do better than a cardiologist in the clinic. Now, why is that? It's because we've done really good clinical trials. We know what the effective treatments are. The guidelines have good algorithms, and the patients don't have to wait 6 weeks or 3 months to have an appointment to get their dose adjusted. A good AI algorithm and a high school student can adjust the doses in a matter of weeks and do away with all that inertia that's such a problem in the treatment of lipids and hypertension. So we will see doctors replaced in prescribing where we have really good evidence and algorithms that are proven to work. And the real trick there is not, technically doing the algorithms, it's easy. It's really how do you interface with the patients and how do you identify the places where a conversation with a clinician is really needed.
Yeah, I just attended a grand rounds this morning, actually. This guy pitching us on how AI and new technologies are gonna, make care better, and a lot of the pitch was that it can do a lot of the rote things, right? The either the bureaucratic documentation things or the kind of algorithmic things, and leave time for, close patient interaction, building relationships, the human aspect that can't be replaced by a computer. I don't think anyone wants to, have an emotional relationship with a computer. Um, so, that's a sort of grand utopian vision. I mean, is that something you think is actually the way we're going, or is it just going to put us in front of a computer even more and make things even more automated and algorithmic and just take away that human aspect?
Well, couple of things to say there. Again, I want to remind everyone I'm not a computer scientist and I'm not a statistician, but I worked with those folks my entire life. And I just think of algorithms as having a left-hand side and a right-hand side. The left-hand side with AI is as complex as you want it to be. It can be the entire internet now, which is basically what the race is on between the big guys on that front. But the question is, who's controlling the right-hand side? What is it that we're solving for? And as long as what we're solving for is short-term finances of whatever organization is employing the AI, it's very likely that it will make things worse and not better. And I think it's our job, as you talk about a role of clinicians, it's our job to say that right-hand side has got to solve for patient outcomes And we can't ignore the finances. There's always got to be a balance because we all know that in the US, a healthcare system, financial rewards are not driving us to better patient outcomes. It's just not.
Yeah.
And so we got to balance these things until someone fixes the basic um, rewards that are currently in our system. And so when I'm going around talking about this, regulation is one thing, but we have to have a clinical pressure to always put the patient outcomes at the forefront of this. And there's an interesting set of articles just out, and I don't have the references at my fingertips, but showing that even in prior authorization, you can completely go the wrong direction using AI. You'd think that would be one thing that could really fix it. But I'm seeing other applications now in prior authorization that are making it better. But you might even ask the question, why do we have that in the first place? It's a symptom of a system which is rewarding the wrong things. So I'm an optimist. I think we'll get this worked out, and I would just like to minimize the harm that's done as we get it worked out because there are, a lot of things that are unknown right now.
It sounds like what you're suggesting is that regulators won't be able to fully, be the ones to really enforce this to make sure it's sort of patient-centered outcomes, and it's all that doctors have to kind of stand up and put our foot down, or whatever the metaphor is. Do you sort of feel like FDA is not going to be able to handle this on their own?
Well, I would say the FDA has never handled anything on its own. The FDA, the best way to think about the FDA, and again, this is just my opinion. I happen to have been commissioner twice, not once. The FDA is a referee. The FDA doesn't write the rule book. The rule book is written either by Congress or the executive branch. And if you think that the FDA can just bypass the executive branch, I'll just remind you that I was overruled in the Oval Office by Al Sharpton on the issue of menthol tobacco, where we tried to make it illegal, and he took the position that it would recreate George Floyd, and we were overruled at the White House. So think of the FDA as a bunch of referees who operate using a rule book, which is written by our society. And there's a really smart clause in the drug and device part of the FDA that says adequate and well-controlled studies in the view of experts in the field. So even when it gets more technical, like for a particular disease, how do you weigh risks and benefits? The law instructs the FDA to work with experts in the field to get the answers because all that expertise doesn't reside in the FDA. Where the FDA really excels is in knowing what the rules are and then applying them in an unbiased way because FDA employees are not allowed to have any financial conflict of interest by law. Now, the current administration has sort of made an exception to that with political influence, but that's a different topic, which I think is just a artifact of this particular time point in history. So I would say the clinicians of the world and the experts in digital medicine, people that write articles for your journal, should be thinking about regulatory science because it's really your views of what's important that will really matter in the end. And even Congress, when it writes laws, it puts out a draft of the law, usually heavily influenced by lobbyists. The federal agencies get to weigh in, but they don't write the law. And many of the experts are solicited through hearings and other methods. And I think we are getting to the time where we need congressional laws, but it's not something the federal agency should do on its own, in my view. And it can't actually legally.
How should journals like ours adapt to this? I mean, if they're going to have to seek out experts on this sort of rapidly developing technology and field, obviously journals like ours want to be at the forefront, but how do we get involved in the policy conversation or be relevant, to policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, I would solicit manuscripts in the area of regulatory science applied to digital health and digital medicine. Let me come back to one other thing you mentioned, though, which I disagree with, and I'm feeling pretty confident about this now. There are people who would rather give their most intimate thoughts to a machine than to another human being. And
Absolutely.
I think one of the really interesting things about generative AI is it's evolving. It's entirely possible now for any individual to assay, what is this person like? What are their preferences and how do they interact with the world? And so for somebody like me, I would rather interact with a machine for routine things, but when it's really important, I want to talk to my doctor. Um, for some people, they really just can't bring themselves to tell the truth to another human being, but they will to a machine. That's very well documented.
Hmm.
Um,
That's really interesting. Yeah.
but if we do that, so you could assay that. You think about this in the sense of, something we can all understand, like consent for clinical trials. Can you believe we still give 20-page single-spaced consent forms to people and somehow pretend like that's getting informed consent when we know you could send them home? The digital divide on cell phones is going away. You could send them home with their cell phone and they could talk to an agent and ask all the questions they want, reserving time to talk to the study coordinator or the doctor uh, for questions that went beyond that. And of course, the translation is not an issue at all. Remember, we used to struggle over translation of consent forms. Even Google has just a handful of translators now because the machine can do it better. So all these are opportunities, but because people will trust machines, this adds a really big element of risk, which may be the place where things play out in court. It's already started to happen. Um, but I hope in the end we'll end up with the guardrails that we need that can then be adjusted, as I say, with a set of principles.
Mm.
Yeah, about once a week, I read now about a person who formed a relationship with a chatbot and then committed suicide or had some bad outcome. That's the flip side of the, as you say, well documented that some people want to talk to machines, but to the point of this whole conversation, we don't have any real regulatory framework about that in the consumer world, and I'm sure it very, very well play out in courts. I don't know what the outcome will be, but it's really the wild, wild west right now.
It is, and I think, out here we have a set of doctors that want to protect their profession. I used to be on the board of trustees of the American College of Cardiology. I understand that. We've got entrepreneurs who want to have wide open space in the digital territory, largely because there's so many people dissatisfied with the traditional
Yeah.
health system. We're making ourselves vulnerable to it. And you got people who say, well, the regulators should just come up with a set of regulations and try to fix it. But that's not the way it works. So I think a journal like yours is in a position to encourage people to have the dialogue that's needed to reach a consensus. But, in the area of efficacy of drugs, prior to Kefauver-Harris in 1962, all you needed was the doctor to say that a drug was good, and it was assumed by the courts to be effective. And that led to doctors advertising different kinds of cigarettes, one better than the other, for example. But because the discussion had been occurring before 1962, if you think about thalidomide, that was a safety issue, right? But what got written into the law was also the requirement for effectiveness at the same time because it had been discussed and the time was right for a policy window. And that, as a student of policy now, having lived through it, so often the key is to be prepared that when that window opens to get the policy in. So you all should be discussing it now.
Do you think, do you think now is the window to sort of get get in right at the beginning when these things are just coming into widespread use, or is it wait and see what happens and respond to it in a few years or 10
I,
years? I don't know.
I feel like there's a professional obligation to have the discussion about the principles. And like I've already said, in this area, I think it's the principles that should be regulated, not the fine details. Again, if it's an AI within a defibrillator, that's a different story.
Right.
But for the big swath of broad areas of decision support and integration of devices with medical advice, it should be principle based. But I'm also at the same time just cognizant that often a catastrophe has to occur for Congress to act. But if you haven't had the discussion, you don't want to be scrambling around trying to figure out what good advice is when you've got that moment. Congress can do some really uh, stupid things if it's rushed.
Yeah.
As we start to wrap up, we really appreciate your time. I wonder if you could, and you may have done this already, so if you feel like you've answered the question, fair enough. But because you've had, as you said, quite an experience in this space, you've already given us some of your opinions. Just one or two maybe big lessons learned that our listeners and viewers can carry away, because we will be recruiting more people to write more work in the regulatory science area as a part of my agenda. What advice do you have for people who are in this space? What should they be focusing on? Give us riff a little bit on your experience for us.
Yeah, I would say the main things that I would emphasize are, first of all, who's controlling the right-hand side of the equation? What is it that we're solving for? Because the technology is moving so fast, it's beyond the explainability phase. We can forget about explainability. Um, so make sure that you know what you're solving for. Second is there is no substitute for empirical validation. That is, if you're predicting something or you're going to give advice, you need to show that you're able to do that up to some standard, which could be very different depending on the problem. We talked about that earlier. If it's a melanoma or not, that's one thing. If it's an itchy rash and it's, what kind of bug caused it, that's a whole different level of certainty that you need. And, I have to say, I'm working with several companies that are evaluating AIs, and the good news for people that are starting into this now is there's a lot of room because there's a lot of crappy AI being sold out there. And then the third thing is I would stress the clinical responsibility. Most of us are not going to be data scientists or computer scientists. We're going to be users, and we need to give feedback on whether it's useful and helpful. I hope keeping the patient welfare and clinician welfare in mind as the primary determinants.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
You've been listening to The Digital Pulse from NPJ Digital Medicine, a new podcast where we explore the ideas, innovations, and people shaping the future of healthcare. I'm Dr. Benjamin Mazur. Thank you for joining us. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow the podcast on your favorite podcast app. New episodes will also be broadcast live on the Cassini platform. And check us out on X at NPJ Digital Med. I hope you'll join us next time.